What I'm going to do is to run you through the global findings of the report, the good news and the bad news on what it comes to global trends on state of democracy. And then I move into Indonesia findings, sharing with you where Indonesia is performing well, what are some of the persistent problems, and where there have been recent rather significant declines that to watch out for. Starting, however, with some information about the methodology of the structure and the methodology of the report. It's divided, the report itself is divided into 5 chapters. The first one focusing on the global democracy landscape, and the 4 other chapters zoom in on 4 broad regions: Africa, the Middle East, Asia and the Pacific, the Americas, and Europe. The statistical data that really provides the basis for the report are what we call global state of democracy indices. And these have been developed on based on international ideas definition of democracy, based on 2 broad principles, being the popular control over decision making and political equality in exercise of that control. And these principles have been then translated into 5 core attributes of democracy. These large circles that you can see here, and which IDEA believes are the key elements of healthy democracy. We have representative government, fundamental rights. So we do have these 5 major sub-attributes: representative government, fundamental rights, checks on government, impartial administration, and participatory engagement. And these are further divided into 16 sub-attributes and altogether 98 indicators. And the biggest data source we have or we use is VDEM, Variety of Democracy database, plus a number of other databases that we have then aggregated into global state of democracy index. And we cover altogether 158 countries, looking at the trends over the last 40 plus years. So we take a very long-term perspective into the state of democracy. So starting with the global findings. And I want to start with highlighting some of the positive developments. We have to balance the debate and to provide some nuance. Sometimes we hear a very gloomy picture of democracy's death in the mainstream media, but when you actually look at the overall picture, it is much more nuanced. And I will focus on 4 positive developments that we can see. Number 1 is that the first finding is that the world is in fact more democratic than it has ever been. As you can see, in the last 4 decades, the number of democracies have actually tripled, the green line here, and the number of non-democracies. In 1975, more than half of all countries were non-democracies, whereas now, 2 years ago, 2018, the number have now they represent less than a quarter, 32 countries altogether. And number 2 is that democracy continues to spread to countries that have never been democracies. And these examples are from Asia and the Pacific region. South Korea in 1988, Malaysia 2018, and of course Indonesia itself in 1999. These all are countries that transitioned to democracy and have remained so since. And we do hope that all these countries stay so, as well as we emerge as we emerge from this COVID-19 era. Thirdly, democracy has proven very resilient. And what we mean here by resilience is the ability, democracy's ability to endure as democracies. And secondly, also an ability of countries to bounce back, to democracy after a hybrid or non-democratic interruption, Sri Lanka being one example of such country. And number 4, democracy provides better condition for sustainable development than hybrid or non-democracies. And we equal here the sustainable development with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. As you can see, the average level of gender equality and basic welfare are higher in democracies than in hybrid regimes or non-democracies. And it is true that there are several hybrid regimes and non-democracies that perform well on these aspects, but they are still exception rather than the rule. As you can see in these graphs here, low levels of gender equality is much more common in non-democracies, and high levels of corruption is more prevalent in non-democracies. The challenges to democracy are, however, great, and we identify 3 main challenges to democracy in the current global landscape. Number 1, the quality of democracy. The numbers may be increasing, but the quality of democracy is declining, and the share of what we call weak democracies is on the rise. We see in the share of weak democracies is increasing, and particularly so in the last decade. You can see this in the red line in the graph. And these are characterized by having a weak formal and informal democratic institutions, processes, and practices. And while this democratic weakness and fragility affects a number of third-wave democracies, there are also signs that the quality of the world's high-performing democracies are eroding. The blue line there shows that the share of democracies in the world with high performance on all 5 democratic attributes are also eroding. In fact, the share of high-performing democracies has been cut by half since 1975. Secondly, hybridity has increased in the past 4 decades. And what we mean by hybrid regimes is that the country may go through the motions of elections, have a sort of democratic facade, but the elections are not competitive and there are severe restrictions on civil liberties. And rather than a stepping stone for democracy, the state of hybridity has become a state where countries are slipping back and forth between being a non-democracy and a hybrid regime and back. And there are a number of such countries also in Asian region, being Afghanistan, Pakistan, Cambodia, and we also count Singapore to be a hybrid regime. We also see very little progress in 3 critical areas. Number 1, there is insufficient progress in reducing corruption. Corruption is the only aspect of democracy that has not improved in the past 4 decades and remains the same now as it was in 1975, more than 40 years ago. And this is probably the most significant threats to health of democracy in the long run. Secondly, there are despite some advances in political gender equality in the past decades, much more still needs to be done in order to achieve gender equality in political representation. As you can see from this graph, at the current pace, it will take another 46 years to reach gender equality in parliaments. And thirdly, the global levels of judicial independence have only advanced by 15% since 1975. As you can see, since 2013, the number of countries with significant declines in judicial independence outnumber those with advances. And that is obviously very serious from the point of view of checks on government. So that was a very quick run through of some of the major global findings. And there are a number of regional nuances in the Asia and the Pacific chapter of the report. And I hope you will have an opportunity to study and look at the report more carefully. But I'm now moving on to Indonesia and the state of democracy findings in Indonesia. This color-coded wheel shows you how Indonesia is performing. Green refers to high-performing areas, and the yellow where Indonesia is doing medium performing, and the red is low performing. I think there is much to be proud of. As you can see, the participatory engagement is very high, as is many aspects of representative government, particularly the ones that relate to elections. And the only aspect that really is on red here relates to direct democracy, as Indonesia doesn't really utilize that much of the instruments of direct democracy, referendums, and so on. The participatory engagement really looks at how the citizens participate in civil society organizations, how citizens participate in elections, and to extent the local elections and local democracy are free and fair. But when you dig deeper, there are some areas where there has been very little progress since 1999, and many attributes which are still on yellow are bordering red, and also areas where there are significant recent declines to watch out for. Here you can see Indonesia amongst other Asian democracies. As you can see, the democracies, regions' democracies come in many shapes and forms. Here is Indonesia. The green ones are the very high-performing democracies of Asia-Pacific region, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Taiwan, basically, and many, and even some of the democracies like Papua New Guinea is not doing so well on what it comes to impartial administration, including corruption. Some of the positive developments, we discussed already the elections and political participation, which are consistently high performing. In addition, in the last 5 or 10 years, there has been a positive development on what we call predictable enforcement, which covers indicators such as quality of bureaucracy, transparency of laws, executives respecting constitution. It is still in the mid-range, but there are some improvements, clear improvements detected from 2014 onwards. And here you can also see in comparison to other Southeast Asian average, which is much higher in Indonesia. However, there are some very persistent challenges. And obviously, one of them is the corruption. Indonesia is one of those countries where not much progress has been made. And perhaps this is starting to erode the overall trust on democracy and the sense of fairness that citizens feel they have on the system. Indonesia here is also far below even the Southeast Asia average. Second persistent issue here is gender equality. Again, Southeast Asian average is higher. There are many other democracies in the region doing better, but as we discussed just before we started the webinar, some serious efforts and progress have also been made over the recent years. And these are some of the declines to watch out for, where we can see some quite sharp declines over the last 5 years or so. One of them is media integrity, which is covering this attribute is looking at the independence and impartiality of media, media freedom, corruption of media. And here, as you can see, rather sharp decline from 2017 onwards. However, Indonesia is still far above the Southeast Asian average, but also to bear in mind that half of the Southeast Asian countries, about half, are non-democracies. Another one where we can see decline is the social group equality. And this attribute looks at the social class equality, representation of socially disadvantaged groups, but also religious tensions and ethnic tensions. Here the decline is less evident, and in fact, as you can see, there was a progress from 2014 to 15, 16, when it again started to have a sort of a less sharp but steady decline downwards. And yet again, still above the Southeast Asian average. Another one is the freedom of association and assembly. And yet again, you can see decline starting from 2016. And you can also see how Indonesia compares with the other Southeast Asian countries. But in this other graph, we look at how Indonesia compares with the democratic Southeast Asia average. And while for a long while Indonesia was well above the other Southeast Asian democracies, we can see now that towards the 2018, the graphs show that the averages are coming very close to one another. And one of the indicators here is if the government attempts to repress civil society organizations. And our data suggests that the space for civil society is shrinking also in Indonesia. And my last slide about the findings is looking at the income level and a type of regime. We have here at the Times the argument that in Asia, the non-democracies are actually doing better in terms of economic performance. And as you can see here, indeed, there are some democracies, non-democracies, sorry, doing better in terms of income levels than, for example, Indonesia, which is here. So we do have Singapore, we do have China, Thailand, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan here. Is this Turkmenistan? Probably. However, if you look at this carefully, you can see that the best performers are all democracies and high-performing democracies, those who are doing best both in terms of income level as well as the on what it comes to democracy development. And just a word about our next report, Global State of Democracy 2021. We'll look at then more carefully of the impact of COVID-19 on democracy, how countries manage the COVID-19 from democracy point of view, what can we learn from this crisis, how accountability, oversight, access to information, transparency were managed, and how fundamental rights, including social and economic rights, are being protected or not. Thank you very much for listening, and I will end my presentation here.